Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we are streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Today marks the beginning of regular tours of the Medgar and Murley Evers Home National Monument. A shuttle will depart from these museums on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. The hour-long tours are free, but for now they are capped at groups of 10. You can sign up for the tours at the front desk here or ask any questions you may have of them. And I hope that you will come back next week for History's Lunch when Belinda Stewart will present Citizen Architect, 30-plus years of preservation in Mississippi. Today, we are delighted to welcome Sykina Butts, Maggie Crawford, and Rolando Herts to talk about the 1969 Delta State sit-in and to screen the documentary that they've produced on it. Sykina Butts is a multimedia journalist at Delta News in Cleveland. She earned her BA in English from Delta State University, where she was associate producer of the Voices from the Sit-in documentary. Butts is a former McNair Research Scholar, Democracy in Action Fellow for Mississippi Votes, and Rosedale Freedom Project volunteer. Maggie Crawford is a retired teacher and counselor and the owner of Crawford Real Estate in Cleveland. She earned her BS in Education from Delta State and her MS in Student, Personnel, and Counselor Education from Mississippi State University. While at Delta State, Ms. Crawford was a member of the Black Student Organization and a leader of the 1969 sit-in. Rolando Herts is director of the Delta Center for Culture and Learning at Delta State University and executive director of the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area, a congressionally designated partnership with the National Park Service. He earned his BA in English from Morehouse College, his MA in Social Science from the University of Chicago, and his PhD in Planning and Public Policy from Rutgers Graduate School, New Brunswick. We'll hear first from Rolando, then we'll watch the half-hour documentary, and then we'll bring Sykina and Maggie on stage to talk for a bit and answer questions at the end. Help me welcome Rolando Herts.
So good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Rolando Herts. I am the director. I see so many people that I know here. It's wonderful. Good to see everybody. I'm the director of the Delta Center for Culture and Learning at Delta State University and executive director of the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area, which is a cultural heritage partnership with the National Park Service. Our collective mission is to promote greater understanding of Mississippi Delta culture and history and its significance to the world through education, partnerships, and community engagement. So our Grants Leadership Academy for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area is a key partnership strategy with organizations throughout our 18-county Mississippi Delta region that are involved in cultural heritage development. We consider cultural heritage development to be community-based projects that focus on preservation, education, interpretation, advocacy, and tourism involving one or more of our cultural heritage themes. The Voices from the Sit-in project, history and film documentary work that they've done was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. The project connects with our civil rights heritage theme, moving towards freedom, changing America's character in the struggle for rights. How many of you all had actually heard of the 1969 sit-ins at Delta State before today? I see a few hands, so that's very great that we have people here who are coming to learn more about this event in history that so many do not know about, but that this documentary sheds light on. This film documents the true story of a protest told by those who lived it. Voices from the Sit-in chronicles the thoughts, actions, and outcomes of the 1969 sit-in on Delta State's campus by a courageous group of African-American students as they struggle for freedom, for recognition, inclusion, and fair treatment. So on behalf of the Delta Center and the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area Board of Directors and staff, I would like to once again congratulate the Voices from the Sit-in project for winning the Mississippi Historical Society's 2020 Excellence in History Award, for being featured in 6 national film festivals, which yielded the Fort Smith International Film Festival's Best Documentary Short Film Award, for being shown to a statewide audience in August of this year via Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and for being featured here today during History is Lunch at the two Mississippi Museums in Jackson. The success of this project is significant for Delta State educationally and socioculturally, in particular for our faculty and students. The project was filmed at Delta State's Delta Media Arts Center under the guidance of Assistant Professor of Art Ted Fisher, the film's producer and director. Professor Fisher acknowledges that, and I quote, "Our production process involved our students from start to finish. Every interview in the film had DSU students behind the cameras and recording sound. Seeing today's students meet and connect with those who participated in the sit-in was amazing." The success of this project also is significant for the brave sit-in participants who are being honored through this film, and for civil rights heritage development in the Mississippi Delta region. Last year, the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area launched an online civil rights heritage archive, which led to the heritage area being named to the National Park Service's African American Civil Rights Network. We are the first and only national heritage area to receive this distinction. Voices from the Sit-In is helping to bring even greater statewide and national attention to the Mississippi Delta as the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement, with such iconic figures as Emmett and Mamie Till, Fannie Lou Hamer of Ruleville, Amzie Moore of Cleveland, Vera Mae Piggy and Aaron Henry of Clarksdale, Dr. T.R.M. Howard of the historic black town of Mount Bayou, the Hawkins family of Shaw, and now the courageous heroes and sheroes of the 1969 Black Student Sit-In at Delta State University. Indeed, we think of this film as opening the door to similar Mississippi Delta civil rights heritage stories being documented and shared in the future. This film is not the end, it is a bright new beginning. You may clap on that if you'd like. Okay. So I'll turn it now over to the film. Thank you for everyone for being here and supporting this, and we look forward to conversations afterwards about this, so thank you.
Campus.
It must have been a dozen or more Mississippi Highway patrolmen.
They had billy sticks, tall as they were. They had ride gear, shields, helmets, all kinds of things. They had dogs.
And here were these kids sitting in.
I came to Delta State in 1967, straight out of high school. Now, by the time 1969 rolled around, we had just grown tired of the treatment that we were getting. We were kind of ostracized, except at night. At night, a lot of the white girls would come to our rooms and talk. And then the next day we would be walking across campus and I would look up to speak and they would look down. So I soon found out, okay, you can talk to me at night, but you can't talk to me in the day. So it was a culture shock.
Campus, like we didn't have much interaction with the white students. Now, we were a group that kind of stuck together. And we did what we did. Going to class and going to the dorm for a little refreshing and then going right back to class.
When I finished classes at Delta State, usually I go home. Like I said, I think race was a main thing. Nobody really, And a lot of blacks didn't live on campus. They still, live off campus at home, what have you. So that pretty much where it was for my time at Delta State. Then I came to the games. All the blacks normally sit together and the whites sit together, etc. In the classroom, a lot of times starting off, it seemed like I was treated fairly. We raised our hand, but we were looked over.
My instructor would call the roll every day. She would say, Miss Susan, Miss Mary, Miss. And when she got to my name, she would say, Maggie. And I would say, present. And I was sitting there and I was saying, I wish she would call on me. And one day she called on me. Maggie, read. I started reading that shorthand so fast, she almost fell down, getting over there. Hold that page, don't turn that page, don't turn that page. She ran over there where I was. She almost fell. Hold that page, hold that page. I held the page and it was funny inside because I knew she thought I had written in the book, written the translation. So when she got over there and she saw that I actually was reading that shorthand, she said, okay, next.
So I don't have original ties in Cleveland, Mississippi. I got involved with the Roosevelt Freedom Project, and they weren't talking about Martin Luther King. They weren't talking about Rosa Parks, like the major things. They were talking about people that lived like right here in the town. I started to do a little research. I looked on Delta State University site. There's only a memorial event. They show them smiling, the plaque, like, hey, okay, we moved on. And then I realized there's no archives of their stories. There's no collection of their voices. As I learned more and as I did self-study, I became more invested in it. But getting actually to speak with the people, getting actually to record their story lets me know I have a place just as they had a place in the students. To have a part in making sure that the history is preserved to me is just amazing. I have my experience, but I also get to document and actually interview the people that helped me have the experience that I'm having now as a student at Delta State University. Hey, Ms. Buckner.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm awesome, ma'am. How are you?
It's one of those things where I don't think you can put an exact date on this is when the civil rights movement begins, but there's something happening in the society here in the Delta and in other parts of the South after World War II. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is that demographics played a very important role in how civil rights activism worked and then how effective it was. Now, if you look, for example, at a region like the Mississippi Delta, the African-American population was, in some cases, 60 to 75 to 80% in Delta counties. What tended to happen is that the white power structure in those areas where the African-American population was very large tended to be more organized and more determined to resist any efforts for change. For many of those young African Americans in Mississippi and elsewhere, the first news story they could remember was the murder of Emmett Till. If this could happen to a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who came down to visit his family in Mississippi, it could happen to anyone at any time in any place. If there was a moment, like a game-changing moment in their lives, it was that showed them that we must fight against the system of oppression. We must organize.
Well, I remember the night before, we had talked about what we were going to do. and why. We had come up with a demand list. We had decided that we were going to go to the quadrangle and march around the flagpole. I remember it very well. So we went out there and we were protesting. We had our signs and things, and we were going around the flagpole. And after a while, I got tired of going around the flagpole. I said, look, we keep going around and around this flagpole, and everybody's just kind of looking and going on to class. I said, we got to do something different. I said, let's go take the president's office. Yeah, let's sit in.
And we just walked down to Keithley's. We went in the hallway, not bothering anybody, and we just sat there. We got down and we just sat there and we looked at each other and we began to chant little Freedom Rider songs.
The day of the sit-in, I was across campus, and when I heard that, I just took off at a dead run to the administration building. I asked immediately, who's the leader here so I can find out what the problem is. And a young man stood up and said, we have no leaders. We're all leaders. And so then I went back into the president's office, and he said, well, they presented a list of demands, and we're just not going to, deal with that. And I think that President Ewing was probably under a lot of pressure, to be strong in the situation, probably by the governor and everybody else that, like his job was on the line if he didn't do that.
And they was singing song, and we was, some was talking about, we need to talk to the president, we need this and that. And a few minutes later, that's when the highway patrolman, policeman arrived on the scene.
They had called in the police, and they decided that they were going to get us off this campus.
It must have been a dozen or more Mississippi Highway patrolmen.
They had billy sticks, tall as they were. They had riot gear, shields, helmets, all kinds of things. They had dogs.
And I spent some time in the service, so I know what a machine gun is. And they had a submachine gun, they had shotguns. I mean, these guys are armed to the hilt. And here were these kids sitting in. You were overcome with the courage. They weren't batting an eye. They weren't gonna move.
There were policemen and National Guardsmen, highway patrolmen. They were armed for battle. And I thought to myself, they're prepared to shoot us. I hate to imagine what could have happened if one of us had had a quote-unquote weapon.
My fear was that somebody would say something or do something or move inadvertently, and there would have been a bloodbath right there at Delta State.
And when I stepped out, I had a friend by the name of Beverly Perkins, and we had gone the east side together. We were really, really tight. And so I was just walking out of there, and I stepped up. Beverly said, "Don't move." And I said, "Why don't move?" I said, "I'm not doing anything." He said, "Do not move." Well, I didn't know,
I remember very distinctly there was an officer that came out and said, "All right, I'm going to count to 10. And when I get to 10, anybody left in this hall is going to be arrested. He started counting. And when he got to 10, he said, "You're all under arrest."
And then one officer came and told her that we was under arrest. And somebody said, "For what?" They said, "Distributing peace," and things of that sort. And we just obeyed and did what they said. Then they said, "We need some transportation." And so said, "Well, we're gonna go get a bus."
And then we had some of the white kids out there, they were raising their hands at us, and I'm just not realizing what was actually going on, because never had that experience before.
I took my clothes to certain cleaners in town, and one day I walked in there, and he was doing the sheets for the Klan.
After the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the White Citizens Council was formed in Indianola, Mississippi. It wasn't formed in Tupelo. It wasn't formed in Northeast Mississippi, where the Black population was really small. But here in the Delta, where white segregationists were mortified of the fact that African Americans might go to the same school as their kids, or they might vote, they might be able to hold office one day. That resistance was much stronger in the Delta.
I don't know a lot about the history of Cleveland. I only know what I heard as a little girl growing up in Vicksburg. And there were all kinds of horror stories about the Delta. The Delta has a terrible reputation, or had a terrible reputation when it came to especially race relations. All of the lynchings that you heard about took place in the Delta. Every bad thing that ever happened in terms of racially motivated incidents happened in the Delta. So we got on the bus, and I remember very distinctly one white guy, and his dad was a preacher, and he was from Greenville. And he came up and he said, "If you take them, you have to take me too." And they threw him on the bus with us.
And then we got on the bus. They transported us to Bolivar County Jail. But there wasn't enough room for all of us. And that's when they got us and put us on the bus and took us to on Highway 8. And some of the girls was frightened and said, "Where are they taking us?"
I thought that they were going to take us to the downtown jail. So when the bus moved beyond downtown and beyond the city limits of Cleveland, we just began to whisper among ourselves. And somebody said, "They're taking us to Parchman."
And once we got to Parchman, the warden was Warden Thickpen, and he had a little session with us. He said, "Look, I'm not responsible for you being here. I don't think you should be here, but we're gonna do the best we can because you are here." He says, "The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna get you searched."
They did for us, I would suppose, what they do for most inmates. We were photographed, we were fingerprinted, and we were searched. And that was the most.
And they had a lady. I'll never forget this lady. She was an inmate, and she was assigned to search us. And they had us going in this little room. And every time one would go in the room, you hear somebody say, "Ouch!" And I'm going, "What's going on in the room?" Well, I got a chance to find out what was going on in the room when I got searched. I had on a dress, and what she did was she caught the hem of the dress like that and ran her hand around it to make sure we didn't have anything in the hem. And then she stuck her hand up near our private part, and that's where the ouch came from.
I still see the eyes, the face of the woman who searched me. The search was quick, it was thorough, but it left there was no privacy. And I just remember how I felt less than.
Death Row had places where we could walk, and we could be on what they call tiers. And we could be separate from any of the other inmates.
We were put in a building. The cells were on one wall, and there were windows near the ceiling on the other wall. So if we wanted to see out of doors, I would climb up on the top bunk and just look out the window.
The warden came back in and he gave us some cards and he told us, well, let's just pretend we're having a pajama party. You all can take the mattresses off the little beds and put them on the floor, and that's what we did. And we started singing. We started singing Freedom Song all night long. And all of a sudden, we heard loud knocks. Shut up! Shut up! And the inmates that were on death row told us that if we would be quiet, they would tell us when we were going to court. And then they taught us how to talk to them. We had to stick our heads behind the commode, and the pipes carried the voices.
But there was no mistreatment there at Parchman. It was just the whole idea that they would send us to Parchman because we wanted to talk to the president of the university at which we attended.
We knew that we were going to court, but we didn't know what was going to happen next. When we got back to Cleveland, to the courthouse, there were groups of white people from the college, students, and they had heard we were coming, and they had gone to McDonald's. They brought us burgers, French fries, and it was like heaven because in the penitentiary we had mystery meat, mystery soup, and stuff that we couldn't eat. So, we had more people than we thought who cared about us.
There was some people that showed up that I didn't know. I knew they lived in Cleveland, but the support they gave was amazing. And a lot of students was talking about it. It encouraged me a whole lot. And it's just something I say I never forget the rest of my life. And I never have. And then when we talk about it in love.
There are some stereotypes that have been forever destroyed in my mind because of the way that the Black community responded to us. After spending a night in Parchman, and I never want to spend a night in jail again, when we got on the bus and arrived in Cleveland, they took us to the courthouse here in Cleveland, and the yard was full of Black people. When I got off the bus and went to the halls were full of Black people. When we walked into the courtroom was full of Black people. The courts had decided that we would have to put up property bonds to get us out of jail. And here these people were, men that were walking around with deeds to their houses in their hands, prepared to put up whatever they had so we didn't spend another night in jail. So when I've heard people say things such as Black people don't stand together, I think, yes, we do. Because the yard and the courtroom and the halls were full of people who did not know me personally, but who had decided, I don't care what she did. If I can keep her from going to jail another minute, I'm prepared to do that.
These 52 students started the movement here. They were the ones who were responsible for what's going on now. They're responsible for us being here, really. They were the first minority students to be enrolled, and they certainly were the first ones to fight for equity and for inclusion and fair treatment, and for visibility, because they didn't have any. They were just being ignored. The demands, they were not unreasonable at all. I mean, it was just things that they should have already had. we're still working on some of those things. They have been started, but they need to be continued.
My mother and my grandfather were waiting inside the courthouse. And the only thing my mother would say to me over and over again is, if they let you out today, you have to come home. You have to come home with me. You have to come home. And we had vowed informally among ourselves that not one of us would go home unless everybody could go home. So the pressure was on me. My mom is whispering in my ear, you have to go home. But we have agreed that we won't go unless everybody goes. And I was sitting in that courtroom and I thought, God, I need you to do something here today.
They came and told us, as a group, that all the charges had been dropped and we could go back to class. We were thinking about our parents. What were they thinking?
I'm riding down the highway toward Greenville, Mississippi, and my mother is telling me all the time she's never seen my dad so worried. She's never in her life seen him so upset. And all I could think about was I now have to go home and face my dad again. He took me to Delta State to earn a college degree. And I'm up here wasting my time going to jail. And I couldn't figure out how I was going to explain that. I walked up the steps to our front door, and I put my hand on the doorknob, and the door opened from the inside, and it was my dad. And I was about to talk, and he put his finger to his mouth. And I stopped talking, and he asked me one question. He said, do you think what you did was right? And I said, Daddy, I really do. He said, I'll back you to the hilt. And my daddy was saying to me that if it was important to me, it was important to him.
Well, it was a great experience. I learned a lot. This is what I learned. I learned that you need to take individuals one at a time. You can't just group people because they are individuals. You can't say they all are this way or they all are that way. You take them one at a time. I also learned the value of forgiving. Forgiving is for you. It's not for the other person. It frees you. So it was a lesson well learned.
This generation now, they have no idea that I was in a sit-in. They don't even know it. I guess that's why I wanted to come out here and do this, because I wanted to keep hope alive. You know, I really did, because I don't want to lose the history, because that's a part of us. And we want our children, you know, to know, just everybody in general, to know this actually happened to us.
Is our mic on? You can hear us. It's 12:36. We got 14 minutes, y'all. I'm Sykina Butts, and this is Miss Maggie Crawford.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
And we sort of talked about like how we would handle this conversation, and the easiest thing that we always done is like, let's do another interview. But I would be asking the questions and answering some of the questions that we have. And one of the things that we really wanted to cover that you see the documentary, but necessarily you don't see the process and the work that's behind it. We wanted to go into the origins of the project. And before I get into like what the students did, I really wanted Ms. Crawford to cover like from the period of when the sit-in happened up until we actually started working on a documentary, like what were some of the things that people did to help this project become like into existence?
Well, I was surprised and I was amazed at when they called us in to come to Delta State. And I went to this little room, which used to be the old laundry room. And that's where I met Sykina and some other people, Tyler Wells. And they had this little room, it looked like a little production room, and they hooked me up to all these devices where I could talk, and they had the lights on, and I was just kind of amazed. And they asked me to tell my story. And that was a little difficult because I had grown children that I had never told my story to. Being in counseling, I figured out what I was doing. I had repressed the event because I did not want to deal with it. For years, I couldn't talk about it. I was a high school counselor in the city, and the kids asked me, well, Miss Crawford, where did you go to college? And this was my answer. Don't worry about where I went to college. Where are you going? And I never talked about the incident at Delta State because it was too painful. And I really didn't even think that I was not telling my own children about what had happened. But one day, one of my students graduated, and she went to Delta State, and she was working in the archives. And she said, Miss Crawford, I heard your voice. I know your voice. I said, you heard my voice? Yes, they have a tape out there in the archives. And I had no knowledge of that tape. And she began to tell me about the tape and invite me to come out and listen to it. And so I did. And in the course of the event, this girl was a friend of my oldest daughter. My daughter heard her. She got her little cell phone out and started doing research. And they dug it all up. And then they began to ask me questions. But before then, I didn't talk about it. But getting back to Sykina and her group, they wanted to hear what we had to say. And after I started talking, it was kind of fun. At first, it was like reliving history. And I was having those same feelings that I had had in the 60s. But what encouraged me was, once I finished talking, the students that were there were amazed. And when they cut the lights off, they gathered around me and they said, we're thankful you told us your story. That's amazing. We never heard that before. And so I felt real good that I was sharing history with them.
And sort of just going from her being the student perspective, but really hitting on the point where she said, like, someone like 30 years later that she was one of her students actually heard her voice behind something. And that was sort of, other than like what Georgina Clark and them had did in commemorating the moment with a callus in 2010, the only sort of documentation that the archives had was in a box labeled student unrest. And it was these old pictures, it was correspondence between the president during the time time and the governor of them uncovering things. And even now in some archival research that I've done for the podcast, we found like they were following these people. They was following one of the organized named Donald Sutton. He was being followed by the White Sovereignty Commission and even had correspondence with the FBI about his involvement with some of the Black Panthers from California up into the Mississippi Delta. And one of the things that we wanted to do with the Oral History Project, which Carrie Freshour and Arlene Sanders brought forth to us as students in the social science department, is that they wanted to actually document the story. Because like part of the research is archival data, but what gives it life is the ones that have lived the experiences that you're trying to do. And it was a major moment in their lives, but also a major moment in like the Black history for students at Delta State. And so we reached out to them. There were 52 of them, unfortunately. A lot of them had passed, but the ones that we did get to talk to were around 13 to 14 people, I believe, that were participants of it. And the main goal was to get their voices before they passed on, because like some of them are in their 70s. I mean, I love the age 70. I want to get there, but let's be honest, man. It's like there's a clock on the time that we have to do the research. And even now, one of the people that I mentioned, Donald Sutton, his interviews are his oral history. He's in California right now in a nursing home, and like COVID is out there, but they had to move him. Like his oral history is one that to me is like vital to get, but there are so many factors to getting it out, and his memory is slowly fading. But that man's history itself could be a documentary, a movie, a thing, because they have documents from him even before the sit-in happened, all the way up until his life, until around like 1974, I think, when they documented him leaving Delta State, going back to California, leaving the Delta and doing different things. But the project overall was supposed to grasp like what happened in the sit-in to like commemorate these people and give honor to the folks there. That was the Oral History Project itself. The oral history was the voices, but the documentary came on later in the fall of 2019. And it was something like, not only are we going to give them a visual with oral histories, like the full-length oral history or interviews, but we're going to make this into a visual thing, because that actually was the right way to go, in my opinion, because everything's becoming digitized. And I know it's had an impact, like even after now, I started in 2019 with the project, but going back to Delta State campus, someone approached me, it was an international student, and they had seen the documentary, and it was like, oh, she was in the sit-in documentary. It wasn't about clout for me. I was like, oh my gosh, this lady from Italy and this student from Guatemala know about some history that happened in the Mississippi Delta in 1969. And it's for them in the visual. It's the same thing with the Emmett Till documentary that's coming out about Mamie Till. It's just like a lot of the stuff that's happened that's important to the younger generation, even if it isn't being taught in the educational classrooms because of testing and whatnot like that, is like they're going to see it in the visual respondents. The biggest thing about TikTok, kids learn history now. They have information at their hands and their access. It's just like we have to put it in their hands to make them want to see it. So to me, that was one of the biggest things from going through the years of taking what they had laid a foundation for and making the uncovered scene. Like that's the task of my generation to me. And one of the people that we did want to hit on was just some of the folks, like I mentioned, around Dunn Sutton, that weren't too much mentioned. I know there's a lot of people that you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about that had involvement with the movement and the project and stuff.
Yeah, I want people to know that I'm here today, but I'm not a one-man show. There were 52 of us, which included the white person, Robert Fulton. He had his part to play too. And I really want to mention Donald Sutton because he took the brunt of what the college was doing. They thought Donald Sutton was our leader. And after we went back, after we got out of the penitentiary, went to court, and they allowed us to come back on campus, Donald was punished because he was perceived as the leader. The president told him that he had to. The president told him he had to wear a tie every day for a certain length of time. And Donald was creative. He wore a T-shirt, and he just slung the tie on top of it. I would just love to hear his story. We all had a story, but I would love to hear Donald's story. But he's not able to tell it. He's in a nursing home. Then we had one girl, a dear friend of mine who lives not too far from here in Jackson. She was newlywed, and she was a freshman, a friend of mine, and she was pregnant with her first child. And as a result of all of this, she miscarried. She lost her baby. And whereas you don't see her today, I just like to mention her name. There was one other girl I want to mention her name. Her name was Essie. Essie was married. This was near the time of the Vietnam War, and the veterans were coming home, and her husband was a veteran. And she could not sleep in the same room with him. She was dealing with what was going on at Delta State and dealing with her husband who was a veteran. When she woke up in the other room, they slept in separate rooms, he told her, never approach him. Take the broom and touch him and run, because he had been trained to come out fighting. So she had to deal with what was going on in her home life and what was going on at the school. So it was no peace, you know. So I just wanted to mention those people because it was more than just what I had to say.
And I think the last thing that we wanted to hit on before we went into a Q&A was talking about sort of the aftermath, or diversity, DEI is supposed to call it now, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
I mean, like, what do you want to hear about that? I mean, let me let you ask the question. Which one?
Yeah. Well, I know that our demands, at first we were asking, and then we turned the asking into demands. And we were demanding that they have Black teachers, Black books in the library, elimination of the N word by the teachers in the classroom. And they acted as though we were not there. Some teachers taught, not all, but some taught to one side of the room. If Blacks were over here, they turned their body this way and talk to this side. So I'm sure something had to happen differently than when we were there. And so I was trying to find out from you, what about the teachers?
Yeah.
And the atmosphere on campus?
I was just gonna say, like, ain't no professor that doesn't say about to roll up on nobody and say the N-word now. Like, I just think like that's not acceptable anymore. As far as professors and Black, I have to be honest, I was mostly in like the English and history departments, and they have like diverse people there. When they think about diversity, it's not just like I see Black people, it's like people from other countries. Because the person that introduced me to the project, she's not even Black. She's like South Korean, like adoptee, and like she loves like Black liberation power movements and stuff like that, like geography. But I had Dr. Arlene Sanders was one of them. She was a good person there. And also Dr. Stewart, she's like Senegalese, African-American, all that good stuff. But I think the atmosphere, regardless, I think the atmosphere is, I do think the atmosphere does lean a little bit towards more like a white majority, to be honest. Even though Delta State students, like Black students, aren't like a minority anymore on Delta State campus. Sometimes I do feel like the programming does go towards that. But then at the same time, I have to look at like what was my atmosphere of things. Like I revolved around stuff like DIA, history, and your interests. So I mean, I think they're more into planning different things towards different populations. But at the end of the day, I see like some of the main decisions, the things that are happening there, I do think is towards the white students there. But I also think that's not only on their part, in a sense. I think that's sort of on the Black students' parts too. Because one of the things that you all had after this was the African American Student Council. It was called the Black Student Council at the time. And my thing is like, if you're gonna have leadership that way, or you're gonna have programming and like the atmosphere set in a certain way, you have to have people that are active towards it. It can't only be the faculty. And I think one of the biggest things that is like a detriment to Delta State actually having like a sort of diverse culture, like having a Black sense of atmosphere on campus, is that the Black students aren't organizing. I'll just be honest with that. I think they organize it, but I don't think it's sort of like an activist way or like a changing way in a sense. But I think a lot of changes come. And that, you want to say
Yeah,
anything?
I just want to say one thing that I thought was encouraging. I had a student in, well, let me see. I think it was junior high, yeah. Nora. Her name is Nora Goff. And Nora Goff is now over the RN program or something dealing with the,
Adult State.
yes.
Yeah, she that one black person I see every time.
Yes, yes. Yes, and I was real proud of that, you know. That's change. Change comes slowly, but change is sure to come,
Yeah.
especially with the young people.
That's all of the questions that we have for each other, and so we wanted to open it up to you all for any questions you can have.
If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Hello, thank you, Mrs. Crawford, Ms. Butts, and Professor Herts for coming out today and for your hard work on this film. I wanted to ask if the Sovereignty Commission kept following or keep tabs on anyone else involved in the sit-in besides Mr. Sutton?
Yes. After my older daughter is a great researcher, and when she heard the story from her friend in the archives, she pulled out that cell phone and started looking. She said, "Mom, here you are in the Sovereignty Commission." And so I don't know how she got this, but she got a list of the students who were in the 1969 sit-in. And she said, "Mom, there you are right there." And they had different addresses for me. They had the address when I lived on campus at Delta State. They had the address when I did my student teaching in Mountain Bayou. They had that address, and they had my home address. And they had check marks by the students, and they had 2 check marks by my name. Now, what that meant, I don't know, but yes, I'm in there.
So they followed you for some years.
I didn't know it, but evidently they did. I had heard about the Sovereignty Commission and how they were trying to block opening it up, and finally it was opened up. But I didn't know I was in there.
Another person alongside Dunn Sutton that it just occurred to me, I forgot to mention, was Beverly Perkins. And to be honest with you, all of the documents that existed on Dunn Sutton, they're available in the Mississippi Department of Archives, or you can go and search your name. And for all I know is, like, if you go and put in that name and the information for the 52 students, I don't know how much information will come up on them. But Dunn Sutton was a person of key interest, so he's the only one that I've looked into for the podcast research. But I don't know if there's like more documents on the other 252 students besides Ms. Crawford.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
What happened with the court case? Were the protesters convicted, and did they go to jail, or were they fined? How was that resolved?
Well, what they told us was, they told us that if we didn't get into any more trouble, they were remanding our case to the files. But if something else happened, they were going to pull them up. And thank God, they never had to pull mine up, because I was a counselor by trade, and I worked at the penitentiary from 1983 to 1986 as a counselor on death row. So that was poetic justice for me.
We have a question from the live stream. How many of the original 52 students sent to Parchman went back and received a degree from Delta State, and did any of them also teach there?
I don't know how many, but I tell you, when we got back to Delta State after being locked up, the pressure was on. And The record says that several dropped out, but it doesn't tell why. The pressure was on by certain instructors. In fact, even in my department, a man that I highly respected, and I was in the business department at that time, I said in the dormitory, I said, before this professor flunks me, I'll eat up a book. And somebody black went back and told this professor what I had said, and he called me in. He was the head of the department. He called me in and he said, well, I heard that you said this. I said, yes, sir, I certainly did. I said, I had a lot of respect for you, but I've noticed since I've been back, you're pouring the lesson on trying to flunk me. And I'm not going to flunk. I've worked too hard, and I'll eat up a book before I allow you to flunk me. So we were under a lot of pressure, and a lot of them just decided, I'm out.
While I'm walking around to get this other question, let me ask, what other things are in the student unrest folder?
Student unrest. There was from my understanding, there was a tape of the actual event, like somebody had taped it. I don't think they've been able to play it, but there was a list of the names. There was also the courtroom documents, and other questions you probably have to ask Michelle or somebody else because I don't remember. I'm getting old.
But are there other incidents that happened at Delta State that are in that folder, or was it all
It was all
just the
about
sit-in?
this one event.
Ms. Crawford, I wanted you to kind of talk about your decision to attend Delta State. And then I wanted to know if there were any instances of folks having a hard time finding jobs because of this incident after that.
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I came from a family, a poor family. My mom and dad had 7 kids. My mother was a maid, and my father was the first black man in Clarksdale, Mississippi, to operate a cash register. He worked at a drugstore, and the person he worked for years had an alcohol problem, and my father, behind the scenes, was running that drugstore with his 3rd grade education. And I said, well, how did you do that, Dad? He said, well, you know, I can't multiply. How do you do that, honey? I said, well, how did you order all that stuff for the drugstore? He said, this is what I did. I wrote it down and kept adding until I got to the answer. So my mom said that I was different than any child she had. And when I decided to go to Delta State, she was having a fit. And my dad said, Evelyn, leave that girl alone. She'll be okay. But I decided to go to Delta State because I knew my parents had 7 kids. And my older sister was in college at Jackson State. And the sister that graduated with me, and Aunt had left her some money to pay for her education, and I didn't have anything, just what my parents could supply. And guess what they could supply? $10 a week, and it was nothing. And so I thought to myself, Delta State is a state institution, and they have funds. Jackson State is a state institution, and they have funds. But I stand a better chance at Delta State getting some of those funds to complete my college education, because where all black students are, everybody's trying to get the funds. And if I go to Delta State, I'll be one black among a lot of whites trying to get some state funds. And that's what I did. I went to Delta State.
To the jobs part, there were a few interviews that I did, particularly with Thomas Friedman. He was applying for a job, but I don't know if it's one on his record necessarily, but I think it did affect him getting employed. And from some of the white sovereignty commission documents that I've read, Donald Sutton actually ended up getting out of Delta State. But with that event, it actually put a big red flag on what, like, you know, like on him being in college. Like it was his last straw. And from my understanding, like some of the other stuff that he did within the Delta also affected his ability to get into the military. That's two things that I know of for sure, though.
I didn't know that.
I know we probably have lots more questions, but we've come to the top of the hour. I'm sure that they'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for telling this story. I hope that we'll see you all back next week. Don't forget that the tours of the Evers House are now a thing. Thank you all. Help me thank Rolando Herts, Sykina Butts, and Maggie Crawford for this program today.